The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Introduction. Imagine this. It's the 1950s. A woman named Helena Valero, born in Brazil to a family of Spanish descent, has spent 20 years of her life living with the Yanomami people deep in the Amazon rainforest. She was captured as a young girl, but over 2 decades, she married, had children, and became a respected member of her community. Then, one day, she decides to return. She leaves the rainforest to find her birth family and rejoin what we call civilization, but something isn't right. She finds herself lonely, constantly anxious, sometimes even hungry. The world she had been told was superior felt empty and cold. After a few years, having experienced both worlds fully, Helena Valero made a choice. A choice that most of us would find unthinkable. She walked back into the forest. She chose to return to the Yanomami for good. Her story isn't a strange one-off. For centuries, the colonial history of the Americas was filled with stories just like hers. Settlers captured by indigenous societies almost never wanted to leave. When given the choice to return to their civilized families, they refused. Even children, when reunited with their birth parents, would often run back to their adoptive indigenous families for protection. Benjamin Franklin himself wrote about this phenomenon, completely baffled. He noted that when indigenous children were raised in colonial towns, taught English, and accustomed to European life, they would take the very first opportunity to escape back to the woods, and there was no reclaiming them. But when European settlers, even as adults, were captured and lived for a time with Native Americans, they almost never wanted to come back. One man, Franklin recalled, was set to inherit a large estate. But he found the life required too much stress, too much anxiety. So he gave the entire estate to his younger brother, keeping only a rifle and a coat, and walked back into the wilderness, never to be seen again. These stories ask a profound and deeply uncomfortable question. What if everything we've been told about human history is wrong? What if the story of civilization isn't a story of progress, but of a loss of something essential? Today, we're diving into a book that tackles this question head-on. It's called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, written by the brilliant anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow. This isn't just another history book. It's a monumental work that has sold millions of copies worldwide and has fundamentally challenged our most basic assumptions about our own past. The authors spent over 10 years on this project, bringing together decades of new archaeological and anthropological evidence to dismantle a story we've all been told since we were children. And here's the promise I'll make to you today. By the end of our journey, you will see that the story of humanity is far more hopeful, far more interesting, and far more full of playful possibility than you have ever been led to believe. You will learn that our distant ancestors were not the grunting, simple-minded cavemen of our cartoons, but our intellectual peers, who consciously experimented with thousands of different social arrangements. And most importantly, you will see that we, as a species, are not stuck. The path we are on was never inevitable. So, let's begin. Let's travel back to the dawn of everything, and rediscover the history of what it truly means to be human. Book summary. We all carry a story inside our heads about the grand sweep of human history. It's a story we've absorbed from movies, textbooks, and documentaries, and it usually goes something like this. Once upon a time, we were all hunter-gatherers. We lived in small, innocent, egalitarian bands. We were free. We were equals. It was, in a way, humanity's childhood. Then, something happened. We invented agriculture. This was our first big mistake, the fall from grace. With farming came private property. People started staking out plots of land and saying, "This is mine." Soon after, cities rose up, and with them came civilization. But civilization was a package deal. It brought us writing, science, and philosophy, but it also brought us kings, bureaucrats, armies, and patriarchy. It brought us the state. And in that moment, we traded our freedom for security, and ran, as the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously said, headlong into our chains. This is the story that underpins so much of how we think about the world. It's a tragic tale, but a familiar one. And for those who don't like it, there's only one alternative on offer, and it's even bleaker. This is the story told by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who argued that life before civilization wasn't innocent at all. It was a state of perpetual war, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In this version, humans are fundamentally selfish creatures, and all the things that came with civilization, police, laws, governments, are the only things saving us from our own worst instincts. So, we're given a choice, Rousseau or Hobbes. Humanity's childhood was either an age of innocent equality or an age of violent chaos. But in both stories, the ending is the same. The moment we started living in large, complex societies, we were doomed to lose our freedom and live under some form of hierarchy. The authors of The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and David Wengrow, begin their book with a simple, powerful declaration. These stories are myths. They are not just wrong, they are politically dangerous and needlessly dull. They lock us into a kind of historical pessimism, a belief that our current social arrangements, with their vast inequalities and structures of domination, are the inevitable price of civilization. But what if they're not? What if the real history of humanity tells a completely different story? To find that story, Graeber and Wengrow first ask a fascinating question. Where did our ideas about social evolution even come from? We tend to think that Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau just dreamed up these ideas on their own. But the authors reveal something stunning. The intellectual explosion of the European Enlightenment was not just an internal European conversation. It was a response to a powerful critique of European society coming from outside, specifically, from the indigenous peoples of North America. This is what the authors call the indigenous critique. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European explorers, missionaries, and settlers were in constant conversation with Native American people. And what they heard shocked them. The Jesuits in New France, for example, were some of the most highly educated men in Europe, trained in classical rhetoric and debate. They went to the Americas to convert the savages to Christianity. But they consistently found themselves on the losing end of arguments with people they considered their inferiors. Native American observers, when they looked at European society, were horrified. A Micmac man told a French missionary, "You are always fighting and quarreling among yourselves. We live peaceably. You are envious. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous, and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread we share it with our neighbor." These weren't just isolated complaints. They were part of a deep, consistent philosophical critique. Native Americans saw Europeans as competitive, selfish, and hierarchical. But most of all, they saw them as profoundly unfree. The Wendat people, for instance, were a farming society living in what is now southern Ontario. They had leaders, but a leader's authority, as one Jesuit missionary wrote in frustration, was in his tongue's end. He could try to persuade people, but he had no power to command them. No one was under any obligation to obey an order they didn't agree with. To the Wendat, the French seemed like slaves, living in constant fear of their superiors. They were baffled by the way Frenchmen would bow and scrape before their leaders, and the way the rich could command the poor just by having money. One of the most powerful voices of this indigenous critique belonged to a Wendat statesman and philosopher named Kondiaronk. Kondiaronk was a brilliant orator and a masterful political strategist. In the late 1600s, he engaged in a series of debates with a French aristocrat, the Baron de la Hontan, who later published them in a book that became a runaway bestseller in Europe. In these dialogues, Kandiaronk systematically dismantles European society. He argues that European institutions, private property, money, and coercive laws are the root of all evil. They create a society where people are forced to compete, where they lie, cheat, and steal from one another, and where they are motivated not by reason or generosity, but by selfish interest. I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, Kandiaronk says, and I still can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils. He argues that the entire apparatus of punitive law, of judges and prisons, would be unnecessary if Europeans didn't maintain a social system that actively encourages bad behavior. The reason the Wendat don't need judges and prisons, he explains, is because they have no money. And without money, there's no way to turn wealth into power over others. These ideas, that freedom and equality were the natural state of humanity, and that European civilization was a corruption of that state, were explosive. They spread through the salons and coffee houses of Paris, influencing thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Our modern ideals of liberty and equality, the very foundations of democratic thought, were not born in the minds of European philosophers alone. They were forged in dialogue with indigenous critics who saw, with startling clarity, the pathologies of a society they wanted no part of. But this powerful critique sparked a backlash. European thinkers, like the economist A.R. Turgot, couldn't accept that savages could be socially or morally superior. So they invented a new story. They argued that history moves through a series of stages, defined by modes of subsistence, from hunting, to herding, to farming, to commercial society. The freedom and equality of indigenous peoples, Turgot argued, was not a sign of superiority, but of simplicity. It was only possible because they were poor and their societies were small. As societies become larger and more technologically advanced, he claimed, inequality becomes inevitable. And with that, the grand evolutionary narrative we know today was born. It was created, not as a neutral scientific theory, but as a direct ideological response to neutralize the threat of the indigenous critique. It took the most challenging questions about freedom and power and turned them into a simple, reassuring story about material progress, a story in which our current state of inequality was simply the price we had to pay for civilization. The dawn of everything is an attempt to recover what was lost in that backlash. It asks us to take the indigenous critique seriously, and to look at the archaeological and anthropological evidence with fresh eyes, free from the blinders of evolutionary stages. When we do, the picture that emerges is astonishing. Let's start by unfreezing the Ice Age. The popular image of our Stone Age ancestors is that of small, wandering bands of hunter-gatherers, living a simple, uniform existence. But the archaeological record tells a very different story. For example, at a site called Sunghir, near Moscow, archaeologists found the 34,000-year-old burials of 2 adolescents. They were laid to rest with astonishing wealth, thousands of painstakingly carved mammoth ivory beads, fox-tooth ornaments, and massive lances made from straightened mammoth tusks. The sheer labor involved in creating these grave goods is staggering. One estimate puts it at over 10,000 hours of work. These are not the burials of simple, egalitarian foragers. These are what archaeologists call princely burials. We find similar finds across Eurasia, from Italy to the Dordogne. But here's the fascinating twist. A remarkable number of these princes and princesses of the Ice Age were people with striking physical anomalies. The boys at Sunghir had congenital deformities. A burial at Romito Cave in Italy was of an individual with a severe form of dwarfism. Others were giants. It seems extremely unlikely that Stone Age societies just happened to have an aristocracy composed largely of hunchbacks, dwarfs, and giants. It's more likely that these societies, far from valuing uniformity, celebrated and honored extreme individuals, people who were different. But it's not just the burials. Our Ice Age ancestors were also builders of monumental architecture. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, hunter-gatherers erected massive stone temples with intricately carved pillars around 11,000 years ago, long before the invention of agriculture. In Eastern Europe, we find circular structures made from the bones and tusks of dozens of mammoths, which served as great seasonal gathering places. So, if our ancestors weren't just living in small, egalitarian bands, what were they doing? The evidence suggests they were engaged in bold social experiments. Many of these societies seem to have had what the anthropologist Marcel Mauss called a double morphology. They lived in two different social arrangements at different times of the year. Think of the Inuit of the Arctic. In the summer, they dispersed into small, patriarchal family bands, where male elders exercised almost tyrannical power. But in the long winter months, they gathered in large settlements, built great meeting houses, and lived a life of equality, sharing, and even sexual freedom, where wives and husbands were exchanged. They were literally moving back and forth between what we would consider two completely different political systems, one authoritarian, one egalitarian, every single year. Or consider the hunter-gatherers of the Great Plains in the 19th century. For most of the year, they lived in small, autonomous bands. But during the annual buffalo hunt, a time that required immense coordination, they would assemble and appoint a tribal police force with absolute coercive power. This police force could whip, imprison, and even execute anyone who endangered the hunt. But as soon as the hunt was over, the police force was dissolved, and society reverted to its anarchic form. What does this tell us? It shows that our ancestors were not naive or simple. They were politically self-conscious. They understood that different social arrangements were possible, and they moved between them. They could create hierarchies and then dismantle them. They were playing with the possibilities of social order. This institutional flexibility gave them a unique perspective on their own societies. They could see them as things to be made and unmade, not as fixed and inevitable realities. This brings us to the biggest myth of all, the agricultural revolution. The standard story tells us that the invention of farming was a single event, a point of no return that locked us into a new way of life and set us on the path to inequality. But the archaeological evidence reveals a much slower, more complex, and more interesting process. For thousands of years after people first learned how to cultivate plants, they didn't commit to full-time farming. They were engaged in what we might call play farming. They created gardens, tended to crops, but they did so as just one part of a broad and flexible subsistence strategy that also included hunting, fishing, and gathering. Agriculture wasn't a trap they fell into. It was a choice they flirted with. In the Fertile Crescent, the supposed cradle of agriculture, farming seems to have emerged in two very different cultural contexts. In the lowlands, along river valleys, we find early farming communities that were remarkably egalitarian. Their art and ritual are filled with female figures, suggesting that women's knowledge of plants, textiles, and ceramics was at the center of their society. They practiced a form of flood retreat farming, which was low labor and didn't lend itself to private property. But in the uplands, in places like Göbekli Tepe, we find hunter-gatherer societies with a very different ethos. Their art is dominated by images of male predators, lions, boars, and raptors, and scenes of violence, including decapitated human figures. These were hierarchical, male-dominated societies that seem to have defined themselves in opposition to the more egalitarian farming communities in the valleys below. This is a classic case of what anthropologists call schismogenesis, when two groups in contact with each other define themselves by being the opposite of one another. The more the lowlanders focused on female-centered, egalitarian farming, the more the uplanders emphasized male-dominated, hierarchical hunting, and vice versa. The important point is that the adoption of farming did not automatically lead to inequality. In fact, in many places, it seems to have fostered a more egalitarian ethos, centered on women's labor and knowledge. And even more surprisingly, many foraging societies that were perfectly aware of agriculture consciously rejected it. The indigenous peoples of California, for example, lived in one of the most bounteous environments on Earth. They knew about maize farming from their neighbors to the south, but they chose to base their economy on the much more labor-intensive processing of acorns. Why? The authors suggest it was a political choice. They were defining themselves against their neighbors to the north, on the Pacific Northwest coast. The societies of the Northwest coast were aristocratic, warlike, and practiced chattel slavery on a massive scale. Their economy was based on the bulk harvesting of salmon, which created a storable surplus that could be plundered. The Californians, by choosing a backloaded staple like acorns, which require all the hard work after harvesting, created an economy that was effectively raid-proof. They rejected slavery and aristocracy by rejecting the mode of subsistence that made it possible. They were building a free society, and they were doing it on purpose. This brings us to the rise of cities and states. The conventional story tells us that once populations grow large enough, hierarchy and authoritarian rule become inevitable. You simply can't organize tens of thousands of people without kings, bureaucrats, and police. But here again, the evidence tells a different story. The world's first cities were often remarkably egalitarian. In Ukraine, around 4000 BC, we find massive settlements, archaeologists call them megasites, that were larger in area than the cities of Mesopotamia. Sites like Talyanki house thousands of people, living in neatly arranged concentric rings of houses. But there are no palaces, no temples, no central administrative buildings. There is no evidence of a ruling class. These appear to have been urban-scale societies organized on egalitarian principles, perhaps through a system of neighborhood councils and rotating duties, much like the traditional Basque villages of today. In Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, the first cities like Uruk also appeared to have been governed by popular assemblies for centuries before the emergence of kings. In the Indus Valley, the great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa present us with a faceless civilization. There are no grand monuments to rulers, no royal tombs, no depictions of kings. Instead, we find a city obsessed with purity and cleanliness, with sophisticated public sanitation systems and a great bath at its center. It may have been a highly unequal society, but one organized on principles of caste and ritual purity, not the monarchical power we expect. Perhaps the most dramatic example comes from Mesoamerica, from the great city of Teotihuacan, near modern-day Mexico City. At its height, around AD 400, it was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population of perhaps 100,000 people. Early in its history, Teotihuacan seems to have been on a path toward typical Mesoamerican kingship, with the construction of monumental pyramids and evidence of mass human sacrifice. But then, around AD 300, something changed. The city's main temple, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, was desecrated. All new pyramid construction stopped. And the city's resources were redirected into a massive, unprecedented project of social housing. Over the next few centuries, the entire population of Teotihuacan, from the richest to the poorest, was housed in spacious, comfortable, stone-built apartment compounds. It appears the city underwent a social revolution, turning its back on authoritarian rule and creating a more collective, egalitarian form of governance that lasted for centuries. So, if cities don't require kings, and agriculture doesn't lead to inequality, How did we get stuck in the world we live in today? How did structures of domination become so widespread and so hard to escape? To answer this, Graeber and Wengrow propose we stop looking for a single origin of the state. Instead, they suggest we look at three elementary forms of domination, which have existed in different combinations throughout history. The first is control of violence, which crystallizes into the principle of sovereignty. This is the power of a king or a state to act with impunity, to stand above the law. The second is control of information, which becomes bureaucracy. This is the power that comes from managing knowledge, secrets, and administrative systems. The third is charismatic competition, which becomes the basis for politics. This is the power that comes from individual achievement, heroism, and the ability to win followers in a competitive arena. For most of human history, these three forms of power existed separately. For example, the Olmec civilization in Mesoamerica was a first-order regime based almost entirely on charismatic politics, centered on the ritual ballgame. The ceremonial center of Chavín de Huántar in the Andes was a regime based on the control of esoteric, shamanic knowledge. The Natchez of Louisiana had a divine king with absolute sovereign power, but only in his immediate presence. He had no bureaucracy and there was no competitive politics. What we call the state is a much more recent phenomenon, a fusion of two or more of these principles. Ancient Egypt, for example, combined sovereignty and bureaucracy. The classic Maya kingdoms fused sovereignty and charismatic politics. Early Mesopotamian city-states combined administration and politics, but saw sovereignty as residing with the gods. The modern nation-state is a peculiar combination of all three: a sovereign power, a vast bureaucratic apparatus, and a competitive political field we call democracy. There was nothing inevitable about this fusion. These elements came together at different times, in different places, and for different reasons. And crucially, they can also come apart. The authors argue that the real moment we got stuck may have been when these structures of domination became entangled with the most intimate aspects of our lives, particularly the relations of care within the household. The Roman concept of familia, for example, originally referred to all the people, including slaves, under the absolute authority of a male head of household. Power over others was modeled on the domestic sphere. The king became the father of his people, with the right to both care for and punish them. Violence and nurture became intertwined. This fusion of care and domination is what seems to sever our basic human freedoms: the freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create new social realities. So where does this leave us? We've traveled a long way from the indigenous critique that opened our story. But we have, in a sense, come full circle. The book ends by returning to the eastern woodlands of North America, the home of Kondoronk and the Wendat. The societies that Europeans encountered there were not primitive remnants of a bygone age. They were the sophisticated products of a long and complex political history. In the American Midwest, centuries before European contact, a great city-state called Cahokia arose. It was a hierarchical, authoritarian society, with divine rulers, mass sacrifices, and a rigid class system. It was, in many ways, a classic grain state, but after a few centuries, it collapsed. The people who had lived under its sway walked away. They consciously rejected the Cahokian model of power and reorganized themselves into the tribal republics and confederations that so impressed the early French settlers, societies built on principles of freedom, debate, and the refusal of arbitrary authority. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois League, is a prime example. Their own founding epic, the Gaya-Nishagawa, is a story of political innovation. It tells of how a great peacemaker brought an end to an age of chaos and cannibalism by creating a constitution based on consensus, checks and balances, and the political power of women. They didn't just stumble into freedom, they engineered it. The indigenous critique, then, was not the naive idealism of people who had never known anything else. It was the seasoned political wisdom of people who had seen the alternative and had chosen to build something different. Commentary. So, what do we take away from this sweeping, revolutionary new history of humanity? It's a book that is so dense with ideas and evidence that a summary can only scratch the surface. But if there is one central powerful message that echoes through its pages, it is this: we are not who we think we are. Our past is not what we've been told it is. And our future is far more open than we can imagine. For so long, we've been trapped in a story that tells us we are either innocent children of nature or selfish, brutish beasts, and that civilization, for all its wonders, is a cage. The dawn of everything shatters that cage. It gives us back a history that is not a tale of a fall from grace, but a testament to human creativity, imagination, and political wisdom. The book's most profound lesson, I believe, is about freedom. It reminds us that for the vast majority of our species' existence, humans have lived with three basic freedoms that we have almost completely lost: the freedom to move away, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to create and transform our social relationships. We've come to see these as utopian dreams, but the evidence shows they were once simply the bedrock of human society. Knowing this changes everything. It means that the world we live in today, with its nation-states, wage labor, and vast inequalities, is not the end of history. It is just one possibility among countless others, one that our ancestors actively experimented with, and often rejected. It means that hierarchy, domination, and the state are not inevitable. They are accidents, choices, and historical developments that can be unmade. So, how can we apply these monumental ideas to our own lives? It starts with a shift in perspective. The next time you hear someone say that humans are naturally selfish, or that large societies can only be run from the top down, you can know that the evidence says otherwise. You can start to question the common-sense narratives that limit our political imagination. The authors show us that politics, in its truest sense, is the collective process of deciding how we want to live together. It's not just about elections, it's about the daily work of building and maintaining relationships, of caring for one another, and of creating the kind of society we want to be a part of. The book is an invitation to reclaim that creative, playful, and experimental spirit that has been the hallmark of our species for hundreds of thousands of years. The title, The Dawn of Everything, is not a reference to a lost golden age in the distant past. It's a promise for the future. It suggests that the dawn of human potential is not behind us, but always before us. By understanding the true diversity and richness of our past, we open up new possibilities for what we can become. Our history is not a closed book, and the story of what it means to be human is still being written. We are all its authors. That was the book summary of The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. We've explored some of its most powerful ideas today, but I have to be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map of a vast and beautiful territory. The real journey happens when you walk the land yourself. The true magic of this book is in the details, in the stories, and in the quiet moments of reflection it provokes. This summary is designed to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or challenged your assumptions, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience that can fundamentally change the way you see yourself, your past, and the future of our species. Also, if you found this summary valuable, I would be so grateful if you would hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It tells us that this journey is worthwhile, and it ensures that you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's continue to learn and grow together.